Once he's dead, he's taken off the cross and wrapped in cloth and taken to a borrowed tomb.
And because of the contact with the body of Jesus, that transforms and leaves a lasting mark on the cloth.
In a vault in Turin, Italy, behind bulletproof glass, climate-controlled and rarely shown to the public, lies 14 feet of ancient linen. For over a century, it has done something almost nothing else in the world of relics has managed to do: drag hard science, kicking and screaming, into a fight that was supposed to belong to faith alone. Physicists, chemists, botanists, and forensic pathologists have all taken their turn with it. And every single time someone has tried to close the book on the Shroud of Turin, it has reopened in a way nobody expected. This isn't a story about secret DNA pulled from 5 continents, no matter what you may have seen in another video. That claim isn't real. The actual story is stranger, messier, and far more credible, because the story about how science tried to kill a legend in 1988, and then 3 decades later ran straight into evidence that the murder weapon might have been pointed at the wrong target. The modern obsession with the shroud didn't start in a lab. It started in a cathedral in the dark, with a man who almost dropped a piece of glass. On the evening of May 28, 1898, a lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pio was given rare permission to photograph the shroud during a public exhibition in Turin. Photography in 1898 was nothing like today. Pia had to haul a camera the size of a small trunk up onto scaffolding inside the cathedral and expose enormous glass plates using harsh magnesium flash powder, the only way to get enough light in the dim interior. Later that night, alone in his darkroom, lit only by the dull red glow of a safety lamp, Pia lowered the first glass plate into the developing chemicals. He expected what every photographer expects from a negative, a rough, washed-out reversal of whatever was in front of the lens. Instead, an image began to rise out of the chemical bath that was sharp, detailed, and unmistakably human: a face with closed eyes, a wound on one cheek, hands folded at the waist. Pia later described the moment in his own words, saying he felt overwhelmed with emotion when the face appeared on the plate with such clarity that it left him stunned. Here's why that moment mattered so much. The image visible on the actual cloth, the faint, brownish image people see today when they look at the shroud itself, is itself already behaving like a photographic negative. Light areas and dark areas are reversed compared to a normal image. So when Pia's camera captured that negative image and converted it back through the photographic process, the result flipped again, snapping into a startlingly lifelike positive portrait, the kind of detail and realism no one expected from a centuries-old piece of cloth. Think about what that implies. A painter in the medieval period, or in the 1st century for that matter, had no concept of photographic negatives. There was no way to preview, test, or even imagine what a negative image would look like, because photography itself wouldn't be invented for another 500 years at minimum. And yet, somehow, the figure on the shroud behaves exactly like one. Skeptics at the time accused Pia of tampering with the plates. So in 1931, a professional photographer named Giuseppe Enri photographed the shroud again, using better equipment and tighter controls. He got the same result. The negative effect was real, it was repeatable, and it wasn't going away. That single discovery is what dragged the shroud out of the world of religious art and into the world of forensic inquiry. From 1898 onward, this stopped being purely a question for theologians. It became a question for scientists. For most of the 20th century, researchers focused on the image itself, what it was made of, and how it could possibly have formed. What they found only deepened the puzzle. The coloration isn't paint, ink, or dye. It exists only in the outermost fibers of the linen threads, the discoloration so microscopically thin that it sits in a layer measured in a fraction of the width of a human hair. There's no brushwork, no directionality, nothing that points to a hand holding a tool. Researchers at Italy's National Energy Research Agency spent years in the 1970s and 80s trying to reproduce that kind of surface discoloration using heat, acid, and radiation. Nothing matched cleanly. The closest results came from extremely short, intense bursts of ultraviolet light, a technology that, again, simply did not exist in any era the shroud could plausibly date to. Then in 1976, scientists at Sandia National Laboratories in the United States ran a photograph of the shroud through a device called a VP8 image analyzer, a piece of equipment originally built to translate the brightness levels of satellite photographs into three-dimensional topographic relief. It was designed for processing images of planetary surfaces, not religious relics. When they fed the shroud image through it, something unexpected happened. The analyzer produced a coherent, undistorted 3D relief map of a human form. Normal photographs, and certainly paintings, collapse into nonsensical noise when you try this, because the brightness of the ink or pigment has no real relationship to physical distance. The shroud's image behaved instead like the encoding on the cloth carried genuine information about how far each point on the body was from the fabric. That kind of encoded depth information is something no known medieval or modern artistic technique has ever convincingly replicated. Beyond the image itself, researchers turned to what had physically accumulated on the cloth across the centuries. Reddish stains, long assumed by some skeptics to be tempera paint or ochre pigment, were re-examined in the 2010s using transmission electron microscopy and Raman spectroscopy by a team including pathologists and a professor at the University of Padua. Their analysis pointed to genuine blood components rather than pigment, and notably, components consistent with blood under conditions of major trauma. Separately, botanical researchers, most prominently Israeli botanist Avinoam Danon and Swiss criminologist Max Free, examined pollen grains embedded deep in the linen's weave and reported finding species concentrated in the region between Jerusalem and the Judean desert, alongside plants found in Turkey and Western Europe, broadly consistent with a well-traveled relic that had passed through the Eastern Mediterranean before arriving in France and Italy. It's worth being honest here. Free's pollen methodology, in particular, has drawn real scientific criticism over the decades, and not every researcher accepts his identifications. This isn't settled, slam-dunk science. It's contested, ongoing, and that's exactly what makes it worth following carefully rather than treating either side as the final word. By the 1980s, the Catholic Church, which has never officially declared the shroud authentic, treating it instead as an object of devotion rather than a confirmed relic, agreed to allow a definitive scientific test: radiocarbon dating. In 1988, three of the most respected radiocarbon laboratories in the world, at Oxford, the University of Arizona, and ETH Zurich, each received a small sample cut from one corner of the cloth. The result was unambiguous and, for true believers, devastating. All three labs converged on a date range of roughly 1260 to 1390 AD, squarely medieval. Newspapers around the world ran headlines declaring the shroud a forgery. The Catholic Church itself stepped back from prior language and began referring to the object more cautiously. For most of the public, the question seemed answered for good. But the story didn't end there, because a handful of researchers kept circling back to one nagging problem: where exactly that 1988 sample had come from. The corner of the cloth used for testing sat in an area that had a documented history of repair. The shroud survived a serious fire in 1532 while housed in Chabris, France, and Pointe-Claire nuns later patched and reinforced damaged sections of the cloth, in some cases reweaving new thread invisibly into the existing fabric using a technique skilled enough to blend almost seamlessly with the surrounding linen. Chemist Raymond Rogers of Los Alamos National Laboratory, who had unrestricted access to actual threads from the 1988 sample area, published research arguing that the specific corner used for the carbon dating showed clear evidence of this kind of medieval reweaving. Fibers dyed and treated in a way inconsistent with the rest of the cloth. This is genuinely contested. It's not a settled fact. Textile conservator Mechthild Fleury-Lembert, who personally examined that same area during restoration work in 2002, has firmly disputed the idea that the carbon-dated section was a repair. A 2026 study analyzing fragments from the original 1988 samples found no clear textile evidence of contamination. Other specialists present at the original 1988 sampling have likewise insisted the area was clean. So while the "they accidentally dated a patch" theory is widely repeated, it remains a real, active scientific dispute rather than a proven correction, which is, frankly, the most honest way to describe almost everything involving this object. If the carbon dating dispute had stayed there, this might have remained a permanent stalemate. But in 2022, a different kind of evidence entered the picture, not a re-examination of the same sample, but an entirely new dating method applied independently. Physicist Liberato De Caro, working at Italy's Institute of Crystallography in Bari, used a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAXS. Instead of measuring radioactive decay the way carbon dating does, WAXS measures something different: the slow, predictable breakdown of cellulose's molecular structure inside linen fibers over time, caused by exposure to heat, humidity, and natural aging. It functions less like a stopwatch and more like counting rings inside a tree, just at the molecular level instead of the visible one. De Caro's team took an extremely small linen sample, a single thread roughly 0.5 millimeter wide, from a spot near the same corner used in the 1988 testing, and compared its molecular degradation against linen of verified age from multiple periods, including fabric recovered from the fortress of Masada in Israel, reliably dated to between 55 and 74 AD. The shroud thread's degradation pattern lined up closely with the Masada linen, consistent with an object roughly 2,000 years old, rather than with the medieval-era textiles also included in the comparison. It's important to be clear-eyed about this study, too. It has not been broadly accepted by the wider scientific community. The sample size was extremely small, and other researchers have published direct rebuttals questioning the assumptions baked into the aging model. This is one peer-reviewed study built on a tiny thread, not a consensus-shifting discovery. But it does mean the 1988 verdict, once treated as the final word, is no longer the only data point in the room, and that alone is worth sitting with. One of the strongest objections to the shroud's antiquity has always been simple. Where was it before 1356? That's the year a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny put the cloth on public display in the small town of Liray, marking the first point in its history that nearly every historian, skeptical or not, agrees is solidly documented. Everything after 1356 is traceable in church records, ownership transfers, and a fire in 1532 in Chabris that scorched the folded cloth and left the visible burn mark still seen today, before it eventually made its way to Turin in 1578, where it has remained ever since. Everything before 1356 is murkier, and it's worth being upfront about that rather than presenting it as settled fact. Tradition and a body of historical art and textual evidence, not direct documentation of the shroud itself, link it to an object called the Mandi lion, or image of Edessa, venerated in the city of Edessa in what is now southeastern Turkey from at least the 6th century onward. Byzantine sources describe this image as miraculously imprinted, not painted, and some scholars have proposed that it was actually the shroud, folded into eighths so only the face was visible, mounted in a frame that concealed the rest of the body. In 944 AD, the Byzantine army marched specifically to retrieve this relic from Edessa and brought it to Constantinople, where multiple Byzantine manuscripts, ivories, and a mosaic in Hagia Sophia depict it being received with full imperial ceremony. It remained there, referenced in inventories and depicted in religious art, until the catastrophic sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when the city was looted and the relic vanished from the historical record. Some researchers have pointed to circumstantial evidence, including later rumors and a controversial 2009 piece of Vatican research, suggesting the Knights Templar may have held the cloth in secret for roughly a century and a half before it resurfaced in French hands in the 1350s. This Edessa to Constantinople chain is genuinely debated among historians. It rests on art history, manuscript illumination, and textual inference rather than a continuous, uncontested paper trail, and reasonable scholars land on different sides of it. But it isn't fringe invention either. It's a live area of historical scholarship, and it matters because it offers one possible explanation for how a first-century cloth could plausibly have existed for over 1,000 years before its well-documented European debut, passing through exactly the kind of major trade and pilgrimage hub Edessa sat along branches of the Silk Road, where centuries of handling, veneration, and travel could leave behind a layered, geographically mixed trace. Evidence later researchers claim to have found in its pollen. Of everything found on the shroud, the bloodstains have generated some of the most pointed forensic claims, and some of the most pointed criticism of those claims, so this section deserves real care. The stains run along the wrists, the side, the small of the back, and across the scalp and forehead in a scatter pattern, rather than the neat ring depicted in almost every medieval and Renaissance painting of the crucifixion. Researchers who support the blood's authenticity argue the wound distribution is consistent with a beating delivered by a Roman flagrum, a multi-tailed whip historically fitted with small weights or hooks at the ends, producing the dumbbell-shaped marks scattered across the back and shoulders in the image. The wrist wounds, rather than palm wounds, have drawn particular attention, since forensic and anatomical studies on cadavers have suggested that nailing through the palm alone is unlikely to support a hanging body's weight, while a position nearer the wrist, through a gap in the carpal bones, is more mechanically plausible, and yet virtually every artistic depiction of the crucifixion for over 1,000 years shows nails through the palms, presumably because that's what artists assumed, rather than what they had any anatomical reason to know. It's worth holding two things at once here. On one hand, the 2010s electron microscopy and Raman spectroscopy work out of Padua reported finding genuine blood breakdown products rather than the iron oxide or vermilion pigments a forger would likely have used, and some of that team's published work has pointed toward biomarkers associated with significant physical trauma. On the other hand, this remains an area where independent replication is thin, Sample sizes have been extremely small by necessity, since researchers are working with an irreplaceable relic, and not every claim that circulates about the blood evidence, including some dramatic biochemical explanations for why the stains still appear reddish rather than darken with age, has been confirmed by mainstream forensic consensus. The honest position is that the blood evidence is suggestive and actively studied, not proven beyond dispute. Strip away the embellishments, and what's left is still remarkable on its own. You have an image whose negative properties anticipate a technology invented half a millennium later. You have surface discoloration confined to a layer thinner than a human hair, resistant to every attempt at artificial replication. You have a 3D information encoding effect discovered by accident, using satellite imaging hardware never designed for art or relics. You have a fabric carrying genuine forensic ambiguity in its blood and pollen evidence. And you have two dating methods run 34 years apart that flatly disagree with each other, one pointing confidently to the 1300s, the other pointing just as confidently to the 1st century. None of that proves the shroud wrapped the body described in the Gospels. Plenty of serious researchers remain convinced it's an extraordinary medieval artifact, made by methods or materials we simply haven't fully reverse-engineered yet, and that possibility deserves just as much respect as the alternative. What the evidence does prove is that this is not a simple case. It is not, as the 1988 headline suggested, closed. That's really the most honest place to leave it. The Shroud of Turin sits in that rare category of objects that has been tested by nearly every scientific discipline available: chemistry, physics, botany, forensic pathology, textile science, and instead of producing a tidy answer, it has produced 70 years of overlapping, occasionally contradictory data that nobody has fully reconciled. So here's the real question, the one without a manufactured ending. When the most rigorous tools modern science has built keep returning genuinely conflicting results on the same object, is that a sign we're missing something about the past? Or a sign we're still missing something about the methods themselves? That's not a cliffhanger. That's just where the evidence actually stands.